Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, December 26th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Georgia and how the Republican Party could be ultimately preventing themselves from winning this governor's race that should be easily achievable in a red wave year in a state that has historically elected Republicans to this position. Ultimately, looking at the state of Georgia itself, there is an extremely competitive Republican primary that is set to occur sometime in the next year, and we are anticipating that this primary could ruin the GOP's chances at winning the general election victory, winning the general election against Stacey Abrams, the presumed Democratic nominee. And the reason for that will be discussed throughout this video because Georgia is a state that is prone to have extremely competitive primaries, even when there are incumbents in a particular race. More recently, in the Senate election, we actually saw Doug Collins, someone who had been a pretty recognizable name across Republicans in the state of Georgia, and he challenged Kelly Loeffler for the Senate nomination, even though she was the incumbent Republican senator at that point in time. Ultimately, Kelly Loeffler won that primary, the jungle primary, with Raphael Warnock, and they both headed off into the general election. Raphael Warnock, of course, ended up winning that general election, ousting the incumbent. Was it because of the competitive primary? Probably not. I think Kelly Loeffler was doomed from the very beginning, but specifically in this governor's race, I think that both David Perdue and Brian Kemp have very good chances at victory, but opposing each other in a primary makes it very difficult to focus on the general election, especially since the Democratic primary will not be contested. And we'll get more in depth right now. So just a bit of an overview. The state of Georgia has gotten a lot more competitive in recent years, primarily because Stacey Abrams came near close to victory back in 2018 in the governor elections. Stacey Abrams only lost this governor election by a margin of 1.4%. Brian Kemp, as the Secretary of State, was accused by Stacey Abrams of clearing the voter rolls, implementing rules that made it difficult for people in the Atlanta metro area to end up voting, and Stacey Abrams ultimately never conceded this race, citing that 50,000 plus people had informed her campaign that there were arbitrary measures taken by Brian Kemp and the Secretary of State office to ensure that they were not able to vote. Now, of course, that is a discussion for an entirely different video about whether or not that was the right move for Stacey Abrams or not. But at the end of the day, it's something that I think has ingrained this passion and this drive for Stacey Abrams to ensure that Georgia flips blue at some point in time. And she did it. In 2020, Georgia went blue on the presidential level to Joe Biden, and then just 2 months later went blue on the Senate level, with both Senate seats flipping towards the Democratic Party, leaving one Senate seat completely solid through 2026. So Stacey Abrams brought a lot of her enthusiasm and energy into the state of Georgia and continued hammering in that point that Democrats were going to win Georgia at some point in time. And she's now returning to the governor's office to run for this position against potentially Brian Kemp or David Perdue. Now, you know a bit about the electoral history of Georgia, but when it comes down to this primary, what is actually happening? Well, David Perdue, if you don't recognize his name, I covered him for a very significant period of time during the 2021 runoff elections in the United States Senate elections in Georgia on January 5th, 2021. And you can see that in that election, it was a very close race between Jon Ossoff and David Perdue. Now, David Perdue, interestingly enough, did better in the original performance on November 3rd, 2020. He received 49.7% of the vote. But because of this runoff rule in Georgia, you need a majority of the vote in order to win your election. So since David Perdue won 49.7% of the vote to Jon Ossoff's 47.9%, you can see, first of all, why there was an expectation for David Perdue to win, and second of all, that it is under 50%, so it needed to move to a runoff. But the original idea was that David Perdue was easily going to win this race. I mean, he already captured more of the vote than Jon Ossoff in the first round. And in addition to that, Democrats didn't seem to have as much enthusiasm in the runoff election as they did initially. But David Perdue actually ended up winning less of the vote the second time around. He stuck with President Trump and went further to the right instead of veering towards the center, and ultimately that's what doomed his senatorial campaign against Jon Ossoff. Now, knowing this, David Perdue was praised by President Trump for fighting a campaign, for embracing President Trump's ideology. And now David Perdue is back, but not for the Senate election that Raphael Warnock is up for. He actually originally filed to run for that Senate election. Instead, now he's choosing to run for governor. But the catch is, there's already an incumbent governor. So why is Brian Kemp facing such a strong primary opponent? Well, Brian Kemp refused to overturn the election results in the state of Georgia in the 2020 election, saying that Joe Biden did indeed fairly win that election. And President Trump did not take kind to that. He hated David Perdue and said he would ensure that either Stacey Abrams would win the race. I kid you not, he said, I would rather have Stacey Abrams in the governor's office than I would for Brian Kemp to be reelected. But of course, he isn't going to come out and endorse and campaign for Stacey Abrams. But I think if Brian Kemp ends up winning the nomination, that Donald Trump will be completely detached from the state of Georgia. But now he's trying to ensure that David Perdue ends up winning this primary and defeats Brian Kemp before he can even make it to the general election. So that's the whole backstory as to what is happening here. And Donald Trump, yes, has already endorsed David Perdue in this United States governor election. He has already said that he wants David Perdue to be the next governor, saying in his announcement, let's go ahead and open it up here so we can just read a little bit of background here about what Donald Trump specifically said about David Perdue, but pretty much just saying that he has his complete and total endorsement, that he will not let you down, citing that, Kemp has been a very weak governor. The liberals and rhinos, referring to him as a rhino means Republican in name only, by the way, meaning you are identifying as a Republican, but truly in your actions are not. And he says the liberals and rhinos have run all over him on election integrity and more, citing that Brian Kemp is in fact a rhino himself and is promoting these election stealing tactics by the Democratic Party. And he says most importantly, he can't win because the Make America Great Again base, which is enormous, will never vote for him. So he's saying that in the general election that Brian Kemp simply can't make it there and that voters in Georgia should take David Perdue over Brian Kemp. So this is where you start to see an insane internal divide within the Georgia Republican Party. They had an incumbent lined up, and in fact, Donald Trump isn't new to these Georgia competitive Republican primaries. This actually happened back in 2018, and maybe it can explain a bit as to why Brian Kemp had a very competitive general election. And we'll talk about that as well, about whether or not that is a valid assessment of what happened in the state of Georgia and what happens when you have a competitive primary on either political side. Now, looking at the Georgia governor election, in the Republican side, you had Casey Cagle, the incumbent lieutenant governor of Georgia, and you had Brian Kemp, the incumbent secretary of state. Now, of course, the lieutenant governor of Georgia seems to be the top name, the person that you recognize the most, and early polling data had almost always put Casey Cagle ahead. And when you look at some of these endorsements, you have some huge names. Nathan Deal, Saxby Chambliss, you have a bunch of U.S. representatives, a lot of state senators and state representatives, and even the NRA themselves endorsed Casey Cagle in this Republican primary. Now, looking at Brian Kemp, did he have any notable endorsements? No. In the original round, the preliminary round before the runoff, Casey Cagle and Brian Kemp were neck and neck, but Casey Cagle always took the lead. And when you take a look at the Republican primary on the first round, Casey Cagle received 39% of the vote, and remember this number, 236,000 votes in the first round versus Brian Kemp, who came in at a measly 26% and just 155,000 votes. Casey Cagle got nearly 100,000 more votes than Brian Kemp in the first round. But with all of those endorsements on Casey Cagle's side, only one person could have taken away from all of that and completely altered the trajectory of the race. And that person was Donald Trump. And Donald Trump did that. Donald Trump endorsed Brian Kemp in what was deemed to be a bitter runoff election in the Georgia Republican primary. And he gave Brian Kemp, guess this, his full and total endorsement in the runoff election. Mike Pence himself even went down to Georgia to campaign for Brian Kemp ahead of this primary. And guess what happened? Remember, Casey Cagle got 236,000 votes in the first round. In the runoff election, after the endorsement was made, the numbers completely flipped, and Brian Kemp ended up winning 69% of the vote. Remember, Casey Cagle had 256,000 votes. He only received 179,000 in the final race. This was a 40-point victory, and not a single poll had him up more than 18. President Trump's impact on this race was monumental. He completely flipped the race from what was entirely winnable for Casey Cagle to Brian Kemp's victory. But the fact is, it was a brutal primary from the start, and that primary could have led to this potential closeness in the general election. Now, President Trump endorsed Brian Kemp, and there is something to be said about that, considering the year was very much anti-Trump, about whether or not that hindered him in the general election. But of course, as the Republican nominee, as someone who was chosen in this primary, you were going to receive the endorsement anyway in the general election, and I wouldn't really consider that to be a valid argument. But there is something to be said about competitive primaries. Coincidentally enough, Jeffrey Lazarus, who did an actual study on this. Now, this is data from I believe, the 1980s and 1990s and House elections and the unintended consequences with the anticipation of general election outcomes and primary election divisiveness. In all actuality, this is pretty much just a study about what this YouTube video is about, and I highlighted some pretty key important parts through the abstract that can summarize what we need to talk about from this. Now, I wouldn't exactly say that this study needs to be taken with full control and it needs to take full precedent over everything else that I've said. I think that some things are just very simple. When you have a non-competitive primary, you can focus solely on the general election months ahead of when you actually need to, because the primary isn't competitive and you aren't going to be facing any major opposition. But also, this study does say that the primary divisiveness doesn't necessarily cause a pattern of general election results, or a divisive primary leads to a very competitive general election, but the anticipation of a very competitive general election does create divisive primaries because everybody wants that chance, right? If you're looking at Georgia and you're seeing it as a position of a competitive race, had Georgia been a solid blue state, David Perdue would not have entered into this race. If Georgia had a 15-point shift to the left and there was an incumbent Republican governor and people knew that this was an easy pickup for Stacey Abrams, you would not have seen neither Vernon Jones or David Perdue enter into this race, because it isn't worthwhile to contest a primary when the general election isn't going to be competitive. So it says this, that divisiveness is associated with but does not cause better general election performances amongst challengers and worse performances amongst incumbents. And I think that's something that is very easy to understand. When you have a competitive primary, at the end of the day, you have less time to focus on the general election, and consequently, you are to perform worse. And considering that Brian Kemp and David Perdue are certainly going to be in a competitive race, I wouldn't be surprised if Democrats have a better chance in the general election if they are constantly tearing each other down. I mean, David Perdue wants this as much as Brian Kemp does, and they are going to do anything they can in order to receive it. President Trump very well could come down to the state of Georgia and bash Brian Kemp. And if Brian Kemp ends up being the nominee, I can only imagine how Democrats or left-leaning organizations will use those attacks that Donald Trump put on Brian Kemp to depress the amount of turnout on the Republican side for Brian Kemp in this general election. The same thing for David Perdue. If Brian Kemp gets a core group of his supporters and a core group of solid Republicans, for instance, maybe that same 30% base that backed Casey Cagle despite President Trump endorsing Brian Kemp in the runoff election, you still have a significant portion of the population that will view David Perdue in a more negative light than if this was not even a contested primary. The point of having an incumbent is that the incumbency factor is there. You have so much extra time, whereas the opposition party is expected to have some type of competitive primary. But with Stacey Abrams as the immediate frontrunner in this race with no other declared Democrats, I mean, think about that for a moment, no other declared Democrats that have any real chance at winning this nomination, the fact that Stacey Abrams is running relatively unopposed means that the incumbent position seems to have flipped. Of course, people are going to be happier with the status quo in most elections, but I do think that looking at this primary that we are expecting between David Perdue and Brian Kemp, that this challenge in itself could drag down the Republican Party. There is so much of an advantage that Brian Kemp could have had David Perdue not entered into this race, had Donald Trump put aside his differences and immediately endorsed Brian Kemp. Had this started out immediately as a rematch, I think that the Republican Party would have a much better chance at winning the governor election. And while I do think that as it stands right now, and you can see this in my most recent projection, that I do expect the Republican Party to win Georgia currently, and I stand by that. I do think it will become much harder. You know, looking at neighboring Florida, a state that is typically closer than Georgia, it is likely red, right? Looking at Iowa, Ohio, even pickups like Kansas, I have them as likely red for a reason. I mean, Georgia is a state that should be going pretty handedly to the GOP in a red wave year, considering its recent history. Obviously, it's getting bluer, but at the same time, you do have to recognize that this governor's race should be more easily won than what we are seeing today. And I think that, you know, this should should have been a race that, with Stacey Abrams as a failed nominee prior to coming back as a rerun, doesn't seem to be something that should have benefited her in this election as much as it did. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of direction on the Republican side and the fact that there is not a clear and concerted effort by the GOP to endorse Brian Kemp. You are seeing his own party censure him for making statements towards different elections, censure him for saying the election wasn't rigged. These are things that are understood as plain and basic facts by people like you, that people that watch this video and recognize that the election was not stolen, in fact. And even if you don't agree with that at the end of the day, no matter where you stand on that position, you never want there to be conflicting personalities within a political party, especially if you are on the Republican side. You never want it to be a Trump versus non-Trump candidate, especially since both of the two at one point in time were endorsed by President Trump, campaigned coinciding with President Trump, and campaigned for President Trump. I mean, you are looking at two people that seem to have been very close to President Trump at different points in time, and now they are pitted against each other, and you have an incumbent, you have a former United States Senator vying for a very powerful position against someone on the Democratic side who has practically had 4 years on top of what they are going to have to actually run for this position. So I think there is just so much wrong with this primary already. I think that this should have been an easy decision. They should have talked this out. Brian Kemp should have either retracted himself from the race, or David Perdue should have never announced in the first place. But it is entirely up to them, and I think that once we see this competitive primary, people will start to realize that you shouldn't be having top two Republicans who definitely could have potentially a future political career for David Perdue or Brian Kemp in some other Georgia position. Instead, they're deciding to run against each other, and I do think that it's something that is going to be detrimental to the GOP by the time the general election rolls around. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.